Hello, VODAN Africa host. This is Erik.
Good afternoon, Erik.
Hey, that's Ivy, yeah?
Yes, it's Ivy.
Hi, Ivy. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you today?
I'm fine. I'm about to send you an email with a PDF of my slides,
Mm-hmm.
but I also can show them from my desktop if that's okay.
Yeah, you can just share your screen.
Yeah, good.
Mm-hmm. Would you like me to make you co-host?
Sure. I don't know exactly what that means for me.
Well, actually, this doesn't have that option. It's just saying I make you the host.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
fine. Yeah, it might help for me to see people or to help them get questions or something.
okay. Let me see because I also want to. I'll transfer it to you like shortly after we start because I just want to see that everyone gets in okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Fine. And so I just sent off an email to you, but shall I take the screen right now? Should we test the connection?
Uh, we have a participant on right now.
Okay. Filling up quickly. Okay. Let's see. Okay, hey everybody. Thanks for showing up today. And we'll start in just a minute here. We'll see if there's any other people who still want to join the Zoom. So we'll give them another minute here. I've got about 36 slides for today. I think we can probably do this in 40 or 45 minutes. And just before we start, I'll go ahead and shut off my video. That way we can hopefully preserve a good internet connection and a good clean audio signal to get through the Zoom. And once I get talking, forgive me if I don't necessarily see your questions or comments in the chat window. I tend to get a little mono-focused once I start presenting. But if you have any questions, we'll certainly try to come back to that by the end. Okay, so I'm looking at 22 participants right now. And I think I'll just go ahead then and shut off the video. And we're gonna go full audio. And I believe you can see my screen right now. And what I will do is I'm gonna show my slides, not in presentation mode, but from this preparation mode. I've been finding that Zoom and the Keynote software sometimes gets a little hung up, and it seems to go a little bit more smoothly if I just show it from this mode. It gives me a little more control as well. So thank you again for showing up, everybody. My name is Erik Schultes, and I'm the International Science Coordinator at the GoFair International Support and Coordination Office. And I'm one of the lucky guys in GoFair who gets to participate on the VODAN Africa project. And this is really just I think for all of us in GoFair, this is such a wonderful opportunity. And it's been so impressive already just in the last few weeks working with some of you and hearing about all the activity in the background. So it's been really fun up to now. And I think today, and then later on this week with Luis on Thursday, we really begin to launch on the ground operations for setting up these FAIR data points and seeing kind of the bleeding edge of FAIR technologies put to work in service of African COVID related data. So very good. So I'm showing logos here from the Phillips Foundation and from GoFair. And in the middle is this, this little robot icon that we use for our metadata for machine workshop. We think this is going to be really a kind of a standard workshop format. And I'll try and introduce that here today. So to begin with, and I did this last week in my presentation as well, I'd like to begin by showing this figure item from the original paper where the FAIR principles were published. This is just box 2. It listed 15 one-liners that we now consider the FAIR guiding principles. The mission behind FAIR is to essentially automate many of the functions for F, A, I, and R. The idea is that there's so much data and it's so complex that it's not really going to work much more if humans are in the loop on these relatively mundane data munging issues. And so we are looking for ways to try and help the machine to assist people in F, A, I, and R. And what you see immediately when you look at the FAIR principles is that metadata is everywhere. You can say that when the machine is performing these F, A, I, and R operations, that it's guided by the metadata content. So the machine has to be able to read the metadata and interpret it, and then use that as the basis of assisting the human researcher in how to do its work. And we can say, I think that pretty safely, there is no FAIR data without machine actionable metadata. So we can see immediately there's going to be a need for this. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that, sorry, small interruption here. The other thing I'd like to point out is that there is, in the last principle here, R1.3, a very specific statement about the role of domain relevant community standards in FAIR. And what was envisioned from the beginning was that the FAIR principles need to be sort of adopted or customized to the domains that are wanting to create FAIR data and services. So there's actually a role for communities and for domain relevant knowledge that needs to be a part of the metadata that drives the FAIR operations. And maybe another way of looking at this is to say that some of these principles are very generic in what they refer to, very generic data operations. And I'm coloring those red here. So that's like technical infrastructure. In the blue regions are these domain relevant regions or these community specific regions, principles. And this will really be, it's the blue areas that will be the focus of metadata for machine workshops. And it's the red area that will be the focus of the actual FAIR data point as a technical platform, as an infrastructure that Luis will talk about on Thursday. So another way of saying this is that, you know, in the blue areas, we can talk about VODAN specific metadata requirements, or let's say, for example, Ugandan specific metadata requirements, or Kampala University, Kampala International University. We can talk about the local hospitals and even maybe individuals within those hospitals. All of these very localized and domain specific elements need to find some kind of machine readable expression in order to really complete the FAIR data point. And that's why I showed the yin yang symbol as well. It's, you know, we need both the technical and the content elements in order to realize FAIR. They're really separate entities, but they're in some ways inseparable to FAIR. And if we keep that color code the same, then this is maybe a high-level schematic of what the FAIR data point looks like as we will be using it in VODAN. So in red is the FAIR data point, and in blue are the data and metadata elements that need to be created to go into this FAIR data point. And so let me take one moment to just give you a high-level view of the FAIR data point from a technical point of view. And again, my colleague Luis will introduce this more on Thursday, and I believe some of you will actually attempt to install a VODAN FAIR data point locally. And then, yeah, I will also then spend the rest of the time talking about the blue areas, which is the things that are relevant for metadata for machine workshops. Okay, so just a few slides on the FAIR data point. Here's another reference to the webinar by Luis on Thursday. And if you're interested beforehand, you can go to this GitHub link to find a FAIR data point specification. So you can get some background on this and even, start taking a look at the code. There is also on the FAIR data point, sort of a generic metadata specification. And this is just kind of a framework or a schema in which we will embed all of our domain-specific and community-specific metadata elements. So at this link, you can already begin to see what this generic metadata for the FAIR data point looks like. And this is a real-life example of a FAIR data point in action. So you can go to this FAIR data point. It is maintained by my colleagues at the Leiden University Medical Center, and it's really just sort of holding some publications and some data related to those publications. So it's a pretty simple FAIR data point, but you can see it in action. Here's another FAIR data point in action, and this is from an organization that likes to keep track of information on rare diseases and registries of rare diseases. And so this is also a machine actionable fair data point if you would like to look. And then just kind of the framework in which we'll operate in VODAN. We first created a fair data point as a kind of reference implementation to show what it would mean for the FAIR principles to actually be implemented. And this is a set of slides that I've shown quite often over the year, the last year. And it's basically take you through the idea of going from data and metadata onto a fair data point. So for example, I'm showing some data here, maybe as a CSV file or an Excel spreadsheet. Here's some metadata for that. It may be simple text files. There is a process whereby these data and metadata are in one way or another coded into some machine actionable format. And we've chosen early on to go with something called RDF. And this is a markup language essentially. And you can ask Luis a lot more about this on Thursday. But suffice it to say for now, RDF allows us to combine identifiers for data elements with controlled vocabularies and ontologies, and with some kind of data model, we are able to create this encoded form of the data and metadata, which as these files, we can load them onto a fair data point. And what we've envisioned is a world of fair data points, a network of fair data points that would allow much more sophisticated search and access and reuse of the data, because the data elements and the data itself are all machine actionable. And then here's a high level view of the fair data point. In this particular form that it's being used, or the way it's being used here, you can think of the fair data point as a metadata publication platform. So the fair data point is shown in red, keeping with the technical infrastructure. And what we have inside the fair data point, following this data catalog vocabulary from the W3C, what we see is this hierarchical stacking of metadata. So we have the fair data point at the top, and then there's one or many catalogs. And within a catalog, there's one or many data sets. And within a data set, there's one or many distributions. And so, for example, in data set 1, we have this data set represented in one case as a text file, in another case as an RDF file, but they both belong to the same data set. There's another data set 2, that is a CSV file. And then there's a whole other catalog that looks like image files, TIFF and Photoshop files. And one of the important points to make here is that the fair data point carries the metadata that points to, is permanently linked in one way or another to these data. And these data could live anywhere. They don't necessarily have to be housed in a single warehouse or a centralized database. It could be completely distributed. And that's sort of the virtue of the fair data point, that you can expose the metadata in a machine actionable way, and you can leave the data where it is. So coming back to then this slide, which I just showed a few minutes ago, the fair data point is in red, and the content, be it metadata or data, are in blue. And what will concern us going forward in the metadata for machine workshop is, how do we take this empty shell of a fair data point and begin to localize it with the kinds of information that's needed to run this fair data point in a secure, compliant way locally within some jurisdiction. And so that's our task, is to load content onto this fair data point. And what has happened already through some GoFair activities is that a World Health Organization standard case report form has already been rendered through this verification process into RDF schema. And these are now available to be filled by real patient data, which is nice. On the other hand, there's all this metadata that still needs to be created, and that will be the subject of the Metadata for Machine Workshop. And I'm showing logos here from, for example, Uganda, about technical things about the COVID virus, about Kampala International University that may be running one of these fair data points. These are all stakeholders or knowledge domains that will have some role to play in crafting the metadata for this fair data point. And then there's this other component, which is, there's a local hospital somewhere that's collecting patient data in some format, maybe even with paper and pencil, maybe not even be digital, but that's okay. We've already been working with people in those facilities to start understanding what that information flow is like within the hospital. And we can begin to plan how we can interdict that information flow to encode the information in such a way that we can get it onto the fair data point. So there's a kind of verification process that needs to happen at the local organizations, just so that we can get some data onto the fair data point without disturbing the local processes that are in place at the hospitals. So in a way, all of that was introduction, and that leads us now to this idea of the Metadata for Machine Workshops. And what I'll show you in the next few slides are links to documentation on the fair, or on the Metadata for Machine Workshop, and also an introduction to how it is we structure our approach to creating metadata, so that there's some system there and we can be making good decisions about how we spend our time. I think it's safe to say that in general, metadata is sort of infinitely extensible, that in a way we're never done creating metadata. We can always say something more and something useful about data that's existing somewhere. And so there's always a judgment call that's required, is when is enough metadata achieved, and what's the minimum requirements we want, what's the priority that we want, because it may take time to generate this metadata. So we may want to prioritize our resources and figure out which the most important elements are first. So this is all sort of embedded in the Metadata for Machine Workshop idea. And here's a link to how we described this when the idea was conceived about 1.5 years ago. And then we can start with a simple question: why these workshops? And I think the answer is basically that we want to assist domain experts, people in medicine or people in a research discipline, a medical discipline. We want to assist these people who may want their data to be fair in actually creating the required machine actionable metadata. And the Metadata for Machine Workshop aims to do this in 2 ways. On the one hand, we want to satisfy the FAIR principles themselves. We want to create metadata elements that can be used to implement the FAIR principles. And that's what I'm showing here with satisfies. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about these 9 metadata components. But we also want the metadata in a Metadata for Machine Workshop to itself adhere to the FAIR principles. So this is a little bit recursive now. What we're asking for is that, if we look at the metadata schema or the metadata instances that are created, that these themselves can be thought of as data. They can be given unique identifiers. We can ask questions about how to find them, access them, if they're interoperating with other metadata, and how it is we can reuse them. So what we want are our metadata to also themselves be an example of fair data. And this is, these are the two reasons why we thought of a metadata for machine workshop idea, because we want to assist in creating data for these two reasons. Okay, so then how do we do these metadata for machine workshops? And the format is at the high level pretty simple. We have a domain expert, and in the VODAN case, this may consist of organizations that are involved with the governance and regulatory aspects of the data, or it may be the more technical biomedical information as well. It might be the case report forms, etc. We team up these people with fair metadata experts. And these are people who not only know metadata really well and who can advise and guide on creating new metadata, but they also know the FAIR principles really well. And they can help us to create metadata schema that are themselves reusable, machine actionable, and responsive to the domain communities, but are then made available for reuse. So that's the idea. We want domain experts and metadata experts to work together to create these reusable metadata schema or templates. This is another schematic for that. There's always a state of preparation, and that's more or less where we are right now. We can imagine that if you break the metadata, if you break down your goals into small enough pieces for the metadata for Machine Workshop, we envisioned that you can actually launch like one-day workshops that may focus on a very narrow component of the metadata. And these could be very streamlined, very lightweight workshops that would team up the domain expert and the metadata expert. We're going to do it differently in this case because the VODAN project is a project requiring some more extensive metadata from a lot of stakeholders. We don't really have the luxury of decomposing our goals into a one-day style format. So, and I'll talk about where we go from today forward, but this is just another way of looking at how we create our metadata, and we put them into ultimately a FAIR repository where we can share them. And the things I've talked about so far, much of that can be found in what I call the handbook for metadata for machine workshops. You can see there's an HTTP bit.ly M4M handbook here in the middle. So there's a link to this document. It's a Google Doc right now. It's draft. So if you take a look at the document, it's not a finished document yet, but it's laying out the overall scheme that we're going to follow in our metadata for Machine Workshop. And as a draft document and as a group working together, I would encourage you to think about being a co-author on such a document here. This is really, in my mind, a co-development between GoFair and VODAN Africa. And you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done yet, and you're welcome to participate in kind of formulating the basic framework here. Up until now at GoFair, we have conducted 3 metadata for machine workshops. And there's a little bit of reference to that on the GoFair website that I'm showing here. And I'm showing a reference to metadata for machine workshop number 2 and metadata for machine workshop number 3. The number 2 workshop was with an organization called preclinicaltrials.eu, who had some metadata that they wanted to build into machine actionable form. And I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. Metadata for machine workshop number 3 was actually run on the behalf of 2 funding agencies, because these funders were contemplating that they could require, at some level, fair research outputs from their grantees. And in order to do that, these funders realized that they themselves would have to represent themselves in some fair format, some machine actionable, machine readable format. And so these 2 funding agencies ran a workshop, number 3, to create metadata profiles for themselves. But let me show you what metadata for machine workshop number 2 looked like. And this is, again, it's coming from an organization here called preclinicaltrials.eu. And by preclinical trials, what we really mean are experiments that are conducted on animals, animal subject research, because you usually do experiments on animals before you move to the clinical setting with human beings. So the preclinicaltrials.eu community were for a long time coming to the conclusion that because working with animals is so difficult, that it would be best practice to actually register your experiment and your hypothesis before you even collect data. And the reason for this is because in a preclinical trial setting, animals have a life of their own. You begin an experiment to test a hypothesis, but the animals are very complicated, and the experiment almost never goes like you would imagine. So hypotheses tend to morph, and in order to get a useful publication, you end up usually with something different than what you hoped for. And so this community thought it was really important to maybe pre-register your hypothesis in your experiments before you collect data. And to do this, they set up a website where there was basically a web form that had something like 32 questions. And these questions covered basic metadata on the project. So if you can see on the slide, it says title of the study, an acronym of the title, contact details of the experimenter, their role, their email address. So there's just some basic metadata that's being collected as part of this registration document. And at preclinicaltrials.eu, that information was captured and then represented as a PDF, which is not really machine actionable. The machine cannot read and interpret the contents of a PDF at a semantic level, typically. So working with a group from Stanford University that are metadata experts, they're known as the Center for Extended Data Annotation and Retrieval, or CDAR. We were able to team up the preclinical trials domain experts with the CDAR metadata experts, and the result was another web form for the preclinical trials document. But in this case, when you fill out the web form, the machine is actually capturing the information in a machine actionable format, and it's creating RDF in the back end. So this template, number 1, can be stored either at OpenView, which is the repository for CDAR, or other places like fairsharing.org. And this template can be reused by others for their own purposes. But any of the metadata instances that are collected here can then also be offered up for analysis later on by algorithms that can now understand the actual contents of that pre-registration form. So really interesting potential analytics once there's an accumulation of these registration forms and the resulting publications. If you want to see this template, you can go to this very long URL at OpenView. And it's just to say that, here was an example of a non-machine readable metadata requirement that could be rendered into machine actionable format, and now is available for reuse for others. And it turns out that even in the emerging COVID-related funding that's coming along in the Netherlands, that there was actually a requirement to pre-register your research. And that requirement now can just repurpose this information that we created in Metadata for Machine Workshop number 2. So even though this concept of M4Ms is still very young, I think we're already showing how it can be useful. Okay, so getting a little bit more into the VODAN case here, we have our Metadata for Machine Workshop. This is, in my mind, the kickoff meeting for that. And because we are separated by distance and we're doing this in a remote setting via Zoom, and because we want to do more than just create 1 or 2 metadata elements, I think this is a pretty good estimation, but I'm going to give us the next 8 weeks to try and come to terms with the metadata that we would like to have on the VODAN Africa Fair data points. And the way I envision this working then is that every Tuesday, and in this 1-hour slot, we can have a chance to come back and I can either guide you on some further details, or people can ask questions, but it's a moment where we can come back and try to resolve ongoing issues. And what will happen in the meantime between these meetings would be that some of you may find for yourself particular roles and particular goals that you want to achieve. And so long as we can keep that coordinated, I think in 8 weeks, but maybe even a lot less than 8 weeks, we can generate some really high quality machine actionable metadata that supports our FAIR data points operating in Africa. So that's the scheme right now. And one of the things I want to say though, and I already alluded to this once, but I see this as a real co-development project between the VODAN African participants and GoFair. And I like to say, when I talk about these FAIR development projects, it's a little bit like building an airplane while we're flying it. And there's a nice video that kind of dramatizes this concept. But the idea is, I think we can all see ourselves in this as co-developers, and a lot of basic fundamental components need to be built and decisions need to be made. And I think the colleagues that we have at Ravelworks will help us to keep track of this process over the next 8 weeks. And then I would say, within that time frame, we can develop real nice documentation and instructional materials so that metadata for machine workshops can be replicated beyond what GoFair can offer for all the other domains out there that will eventually probably seek to have a metadata for machine workshop for themselves. So this is also to say that for those of you participating in this, you may begin to see yourselves as potential facilitators of metadata for machine workshops as well. So I think there's a really nice opportunity here, if the demand holds, that we can try to scale this concept and help people to better and better create metadata for their FAIR goals. Okay, so getting to some of the more technical elements and the things that that may keep you busy over the next week. If you go to the Metadata for Machine Handbook, you will see a description for this particular figure. And what I'm doing is, again, I'm going back to the blue domain-specific metadata requirements of the FAIR principles. And I'm just trying to enumerate the different features here that we could, in principle, have solutions for. We don't necessarily have to create metadata for each of these 9 metadata components. In effect, we might want to, as of next week, we might even want to try and prioritize as a group, what are the metadata components that we really want to make sure we have satisfied first, and then which ones can come later. And so I think it's nice to be systematic, because then we can at least figure out a coherent roadmap, and we can either pursue that together, or we could even find ways of dividing the labor and maybe do things in parallel. But you will see a more in-depth description for what each of these 9 metadata components are asking for in the handbook. But I can give you insight to how we were thinking about this from the beginning. And at the end of this slide deck, you will see a list of reading references and recommended references. But this is one of them. And this is work that I was involved with, as well as Luis. And this was published in the year 2018, so a couple years ago. And this was, it was a paper that was called A Design Framework and Exemplar Metrics for Fairness. And there was supplemental data for this. And I have a short bit.ly link here, M4M Fair Metrics document. You can get to it at that bit.ly. And what I want to stress here is that this approach to thinking about the FAIR principles, how do we envision these principles being implemented, and how would we ever build an evaluator that would, or let's say a validator, that would tell us if we were in compliance with the FAIR principles? That was the subject of this paper, and what's contained in this document here, Fair Metrics All, is basically a breakdown of each of the FAIR principles at a very technical level, and at least one way of interpreting what's needed in order for the machine to do, say, in this case, principle F1. So I'm going to zoom in on, so let me say this. In the document, you will see 14 specifications, like is shown here, that refer in some way or another to all of the FAIR principles. And I'm going to zoom in now on this schema here and show you how these metrics worked. What we said was that, okay, we have a FAIR principle like F1. In this case, we were looking at that principle. We were looking at this idea of identifier persistence. So if you bear with me, I'm going to go back 2 slides here. If we look at F1, it says metadata and data are assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. So if I come back to here, this metric is trying to get at this idea of identifier persistence. And although the guarantee of uniqueness is kind of an algorithmic technical problem that can be solved using some kind of technical implementation, the idea of identifier persistence is more of a social contract or a decision that a domain has to make for itself. What is the persistence policy for your data or your metadata? And that's a question that can only be answered by domain experts on the ground, or let's say jurisdictional stakeholders who want to say, hey, we have medical records here, they must be persistent for X number of years. So what we were asking for in this metric was, what is being measured? Well, we want to see this policy document that describes for the identifier schema what's the time frame and the implications of the policy or the change in the persistence of an identifier. There's a description here. Why do we measure it? Well, if you change the identifier schema, you can impact lots of other functions like looking up the content, for linking it, for sharing it. And so what must be provided in order to comply with this metric is basically a URL that resolves to this policy document. And you could even build a machine that could actually do a get call and locate whether or not it got to that document. And I'm showing this here, not that the metadata we create in the metadata for Machine Workshop has to comply with this metric. That's not why I want to show this, but it's just to give you a feeling for why we are asking for certain metadata elements to begin with, and what might be required as a reasonable response to the FAIR principle requesting these things. Let me show you another example, in this case for component number 5. And again, I'll just go back to this figure. Metadata component number 5 is referring to the fact that metadata are accessible even when the data are no longer available. So here, the metric was having to do with metadata longevity. It was for principle A2. And what we were looking for in this case was a URL to the formal metadata longevity plan. So another policy document. And we just want to see a link to that document. But what it implies is that that document exists. And it might even imply that that document is machine readable. And that might be one of the things we choose to do in the course of our metadata for Machine Workshops. So what I would recommend doing for between this week and next week to really understand how the metadata works for FAIR and what we will be asking for is to review the handbook, which is only a few pages, and that's at this link here. And then to also review this, this FAIR metrics data, this data file that we had. And there's also a nice link to it here. To sort of review and cross-reference to see if you can get a better understanding of what machine actionable metadata might be interesting to have or useful to have to satisfy the FAIR principles. And then what we will do next week is begin to describe how these things, how these metadata components might fit into that generic metadata schema at the FAIR data point. So we can begin to build modular metadata components. We can prioritize how we want to do this. We can make them as elaborate or as simple as we would like. It's really up to us. But we can begin to scope our plan for the metadata for Machine Workshop going forward in a pretty systematic way. And we will eventually take the metadata components that we conceive. We will work with metadata experts to render them into this RDF or machine actionable format, and we can load them onto the FAIR data point. And to the degree we do this, in the next 4 to 8 weeks, I think is it will begin to represent one of the most pristine examples of fairness, I think, that we could ever point to at the moment. So I hope that's understandable. I'll leave it there for today. Here are a bunch of resources that I've mentioned throughout the talk. And there's some things that I recommend that you review, but there's others here in bold that I would like you to read for next week. And until next week, that will be it for me. I will be obviously on the Slack channel, and as people are reading and have questions, I'm happy to take questions there. If the questions come too quickly, then maybe we can even set up additional Zoom calls to kind of take these things all at one time. But in any case, I'm engaged, and I will be monitoring your questions or your comments in the meantime. But in any case, we will see you at this point in time next week. Is there any questions from today right now?
Hi.
Hi there.
I have a question. So you mentioned that you're looking for domain experts and then metadata experts, and then you'll produce a schema, which I think is a great idea. So is there, I think to look for a domain expert, you need to first talk about which domain specifically. So what domain are we looking to start with?
Yeah, okay, great question. So imagine in a world of fair data points, like here, that there may be a fair data point operating in different African countries. And then we send out, say, a query or an algorithm that will go to each of the fair data points and ask some questions or do some analyses. What we need at the highest level is just a simple explanation of who is that fair data point? Who's the owner of that fair data point? And is there some way that we can trust that this is an authentic fair data point from that owner? And maybe the fair data point is jointly run by several organizations. So for example, maybe it's the case that the fair data point is run under the governance and regulatory structure set out by the Ministry of Health. So maybe we need to reference the Ministry of Health in that context. Maybe the fair data point is actually being run, for example, at Kampala International University. So maybe Kampala International University would also like to identify itself. And then the data itself might be coming from various hospitals. And so those hospitals will need to somehow be identified. Maybe it's relevant to have some geolocation information there, some sort of province description. So, so these different, I would say these different data owners or these different stakeholders at that fair data point need to identify themselves. And so that's why I'm showing here a collection of logos. One might be at the national level, another might be at the university. We're using World Health Organization standards for the CRF. If you want to describe information about the coronavirus, there are controlled vocabularies out there and ontologies that we could choose to reuse to do that. And so the domain experts are, maybe a more general word to use would be stakeholder. You know, who has a stake in this fair data point? And we at least need to know who they are. But then in each case, they will express some information. So if we want to talk about governance and regulatory frameworks on that fair data point, you know, how is patient data to be handled? Yeah, we probably want to refer back to policy documents or to other ways of expressing those regulations. And that would be then one of the domains is sort of just describing the regulatory framework. The other domain might be more the biomedical and et cetera. Does that answer your question?
Yes, so I'm just going to say this. I think that's something that really has to be clarified as we get in more members, because so as a healthcare expert, when I hear fair and health and domain, I'm thinking things like gynecology, orthopedics. That's what healthcare domain for many healthcare practitioners mean. But if we're talking more stakeholders, I think moving forward, that really has to be clarified.
Yeah, well, I think it's really, it's worked out very well, I think, so far. And I think we really have to credit Miriam for this, Professor Miriam, that she's been really wanting to engage, you know, not just kind of the medical or biomedical aspects of the fair data point, but really wanting to embed them into the local jurisdiction and really trying to make this case for data visiting, where the data stay in one place and algorithms come in under controlled, well-defined conditions, can be given access to the data. And that whole use case, I guess, is why we need to broaden the stakeholders to be more than just sort of these biomedical domains. And we need really to hear from the regional authorities who has something to say about how data is to be accessed in those areas.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Hello, I have another question, a request.
Yes.
I'm sorry I joined in late. I'm requesting you to share the content you've been using so that I can read through and catch up, or if there is a video, if you've been recording, you share with us that video so that I can also be on the same page. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. I see that we are recording this webinar right now, and I'm sure it will be made available to watch again. And the slides, I believe, will be loaded onto the Slack channel at some point. So you can access them through Slack. So yeah, everything here and everything I mentioned today is referenced in the slide deck itself. So I think you have a complete package here going forward.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Well, okay then.
Erik, this
yeah.
is speaking. I would just like to, first of all, thank you. It was, I think, very thorough and also very clear at the same time. So I'm really very grateful for this first training. And I see that at the moment we have 37 participants, which is just phenomenal from all across. And so congratulations to all. A big thank you to Professor Francesca, who has been working really so hard to make sure that everybody is there, and everybody who has been helping her, Mariam, Putu, so many others, and also Ivy, who has come on board to help organize this training in a smooth way. And seeing from today's experience, this is very possible and feasible to do it this way. The seminar has been recorded, as you saw, and it will be distributed. We will make a version that has low bandwidth so that it can be easily accessed. And I also think perhaps, Erik, that you will make the slides available so that these can be uploaded on the various channels. And I have two further announcements to make also. The first announcement is that you will have seen and you will see that you will be invited to the training on Thursday, the same time, of Luis Bonino, where you will then get all the information on how to install the FAIR data point. So you are all welcome to that. And then also in 15 minutes after we finish this training session, you are invited to the defense of Alia Aktau in Kazakhstan, where she will present her thesis and where she, sorry, this was my phone. Sorry, that was Alia Aktau, who will be defending her master thesis. And as part of the master thesis, she set up a FAIR data point, and she also produced the FAIR data. In this case, these were data related to cancer patients, but there are also medical data. And I think that her presentation will also be a very clear and very good example. She did her internship with Erik in the Go FAIR Foundation office, so she has a good experience. So you're all very welcome, and we'll just put the link in the different channels as soon as we finish this seminar. And with that, I would like again to thank everybody. I think next time there might be even more questions. I think that Erik, people are digesting everything. More questions, no doubt, will come up. I'm really very sorry. I need to organize this differently. I'm very sorry. I just want to say my last sentence again. Thank you all very, very much. Sorry for my very bad organization and interruption, but everybody else did brilliantly. Thank you. Over to you, Erik or Francesca or Ivy. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Miriam. And yeah, I think I've been given control of the driver's seat here. So I think I have the authority now to sign off, but I also would like to thank everyone. Don't hesitate when you have questions. We will try to field them as well as we can between now and next week. And like I said, I can be available for Zoom calls in between as well. But if you can take a look at those two documents and try to, for yourself, come to a better feeling for the kinds of metadata we might be asking for. But that will be the subject of next week's call.
Erik, this is Miriam, if I might just add one organizational thing, yeah. And this is that perhaps for you, it might be easier that those conversations take place within the country's Slack channels. In some cases, they might even be subdivided, like for instance in Ethiopia, where we have 2 different groups working. But I would say that maybe for your sake, seeing that
Hi, how are you? I'm good. How are you? Yeah, not bad, thank you. Really good.
Miriam, I totally agree.
Long weekend in the Netherlands this weekend, so.
And we will be tracking.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be today, but of course.
Very good, everyone. I will sign off from the Zoom now, and maybe see you at Alia's talk in a few minutes.
Thank you, Erik.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye-bye, Erik. Thank you.
Yep.